Welcome back everyone, this is History with Hilberts, your host as always, and today I'm going to be talking about Henry VII and his financial policies. Now, a quick note before I start this video, I haven't been replying to any comments lately, it's absolutely shocking and barbarous, but I will do this at the end of this week. I've just had a very busy time at the moment, but I will get back to you soon, so don't worry about that. Now, Henry VII. He is remembered as being a sort of old miserly guy who raked in the cash at every opportunity. Whether this is true or not, well, maybe not. Maybe he was justified in doing this, maybe he needed to stay in power, but I'll cover this a bit later on in the video. But he did make a lot of money, and he did this through very successful financial policies. And I'm going to talk about them here. So, first of all, we have to remember that Henry VII, he became king through usurpation, and this is basically where he kills Richard III, who was the king, at the Battle of Bosworth in 1485. And when he does this, he inherits the English throne. He kills Richard III, who was king, and he becomes king himself. But he also inherits England's debts, and England has quite a bit of debt at this point. So he's in the red, if you will, so he needs to start making some cash. Now, how do medieval rulers, or Renaissance rulers rather, because this is going on to the end of the 15th, start of the 16th century, how do they make money? Well, taxes. Taxes was one of the large ones. And you had ordinary revenue, which is how the king would make money, day in, day out. That's how he'd get the majority of his money, just, when things are nice, going well in the country, then you have this source of income. And some examples of how you get ordinary revenue are from the crown lands, which were lands owned by the king, because the king would distribute land to the nobles in feudalism and later bastard feudalism, where money was involved. But the king himself would also have lands which belonged to the king, and he would then reap the rewards from these lands. Now, another way that the king would do this was through trade, and through trade it's basically the tariffs that come in from the trade. So you have a tax imposed on importing and exporting, and the merchants have to pay you so much to come and trade in whichever of your ports, and you have taxes on goods, that kind of thing, called tariffs. So that's how the king would make money. Now, you also have these things called bonds and recognizances, which I will get into, which is basically when people take out loans from the king and then have to repay them, and then, you can add interest and all of that. Now, you also have extraordinary revenue, and extraordinary revenue was for times of need. So the most common reason why someone would go for extraordinary revenue wasn't just, to tax the population, because they'd run out of money very soon. It was to go to war, as you can see here. So this would entail the king's magistrates and justices going out into the countryside and shaking the peasants loose of any loose florins they have in their pockets, so that they can fill the king's coffers and they can head to war. Now, this might also include some grants from the nobles, some loans which the king would make to a bank or to a noble family which he'd repay, or these things which were called benevolences, which was basically where the king would rob his nobles and say, well, I'm the king, I'll treat you nicely after this because you've given me this grant, whether it was voluntary or not, although that is literally the definition of theft. Now, this, of course, would make the people very angry, and the people in Henry VII's period actually rose up in rebellion a few times, the most notable being Yorkshire, and that should be 1487, by the way, not 1486, and Cornwall in 1497, which then got involved with Perkin Warbeck as well. Now, to do this, the king had to go through Parliament, and Parliament back in the Tudor time was very different to how it is today. Now, the Parliament, rather than meeting all the time like it does in most democratic countries, it only met when the king called it up, and then they could, bring forward their grievances about their people and things. But if the king never called Parliament, Parliament would never sit. It was that simple. Now, the king called Parliament several times in his reign. It was almost on a bi-yearly basis in the beginning, and then it became less and less frequent towards the end, perhaps suggesting that he becomes more successful, independent, less reliant on Parliament towards the end of his reign. Now, in 1485, which is the year he is crowned king, and he crowns himself king before calling up Parliament, so that everyone knows that he did this, he didn't need Parliament to help him. But in 1485, at the Parliament, he is granted tonnage and poundage, which is basically customs revenues, so this brings in even more money. So this is how he uses the Parliament to get money. Now, in 1487, Parliament grants him money to pay off the mercenaries who fought off Lord Lovell's rising, and this was quite a serious uprising, I believe, in Worcester, which tried to overthrow Henry. Was it in Worcester? I can't remember. I think it was Worcester. It was one where they tried to overthrow King Henry, and they tried to put, I believe, Lambert Simnel on the throne, who was a Yorkist pretender. And this parliament was called to get this extraordinary revenue in to pay off the people who'd fought against the rebels for Henry VII. Now in 1489 the parliament again granted money, and this time it was in preparation to go to war. Now in my other video I briefly mentioned the Breton crisis, and I'll make a video on the foreign policy during this era as well. And the Breton crisis, basically to sum it up, was the French wanted to capture Brittany, which is this area in the northwest of France. It's basically a long sea arm. And the English and the Britons were allied, so when the French tried to invade Brittany, the English basically got involved, and then the English crossed over the channel and besieged Boulogne, which I will mention at the end, actually, the treaty that sums that up. But this parliamentary act granted money so that Henry could raise an army, and this was before the actual invasion of France, but war was very likely, so he wanted to get his troops ready, because these things did take time. And again in 1496 there's a grant from Parliament to fight off a Scottish invasion, because of course you need money to raise an army. Now, he also creates his own sort of council, which is called the Council Learned in Law, and this is key to understanding how Henry became so rich. Now, it was founded in 1495, and it was first led by Bray, and then by Empson and Dudley, and these guys were lawyers. Now, back then, it was sort of the nobility, the gentry, and the clergy, who were the church class. They were the only ones who really did much of note in society, and the monarch himself. But Henry VII, he started to promote and to help people of lower classes as well. For instance, the merchants, who were sort of, you can't really call them a middle class, it's not comparable. They weren't quite the scum of the earth, they weren't quite the peasants, the labourers, but they definitely weren't the nobility, they definitely weren't the gentry or the clergy. And the lawyers would have been from a similar sort of class, that sort of, it wasn't right at the bottom, but it definitely wasn't the top. And that's one of the reasons why the nobility hated these guys. And basically they had full authority. So nobody could stand up against the Council Learned in Law, because the king completely backed them. And they didn't need any parliament or any jurisdiction like that to act. So what did they actually do? Well, their role was financial and political. They controlled the nobility whilst making money for the king. So it's sort of a win-win situation. Now what they actually did was that they would have these things called bonds and recognizances. And bonds and recognizances, to break them down, the bonds were the written contract which promised good behaviour or the fulfilment of a certain task for the king. So it's like, I don't know if you ever did this when you were younger, if they made you sign any sort of, good behaviour promise contract, it's like that, but then obviously much more serious. And these had been used before, so for example by Edward IV, who had ruled before Henry VII and before Richard III. But Henry used a lot more bonds and recognizances. I think he used 46 of them on different noble families. I think Edward used about 21, but I don't think the numbers are that important. And Richard III, who was Edward IV's brother, who ruled after Edward IV and before Henry VII, he used hostages more than this. And obviously, when you take someone's son hostage, they really hate you, and it generally doesn't work, as is seen by William Stanley, who defected from Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth because Richard III had taken his son hostage, as well as other reasons. Now, the recognizances, it's sort of in the name, it's the recognition, it's you recognizing the fact that you have an existing debt or another obligation to the king. Now, you don't really need to get these two apart, you can mention them together, but that's what they both mean. And these didn't necessarily have to be real, you didn't actually have to have a debt. The Council Learned in Law was such that it could create one, and even if it wasn't true, it didn't matter because they had full authority, so they could do that. And these were very much hated by the nobility. It was a very unmedieval thing to do. The medieval way of kingship was, to have a good relation with the nobility, to reward the nobility in times of war. But Henry was a Renaissance man, it was going into the age of the Renaissance. And this basically held them as financial hostages, so to speak. And as soon as Henry VII died, we see that Empson and Dudley are immediately thrown into jail and then executed a year later in 1510 under Henry VIII, who tries to get this older, more medieval relationship with his nobility going. So how does Henry make the dollar, so to speak? Well, in the bonds and recognizances in 1493, he makes £3,000 from it. That's all right. Then 2 years later, he creates the Council Learned in Law, and just to show how much impact they have, in 1505, which is 4 years before its death, they are making £35,000 from bonds and recognisances, which was a huge sum back then. So you can see that the council learned in law were really making Henry a lot of dosh. Now, I did briefly touch on trade before, but I'm going to have a dedicated section to it because it's quite an important one and quite a lot does happen in this era. Now, to understand trade, I'm going to take a very brief look at the situation in Europe during this period. So obviously we have England, which is where Henry is ruling. And it's important to remember here that Scotland, which is to the north of England, was back then a fully independent country with its own line of kings and its own laws. They weren't together like they are now in the United Kingdom. So those two acted independently. Now, sometimes they worked together and sometimes they had at each other, but I will look into this in my foreign policy video. Now, I also mentioned Brittany before, which is this long arm, and you can see it there in blue. And France was the real big superpower. And all of these ones around France, so you have Spain, you have the Holy Roman Empire, and England, and as well Brittany, who's being picked on by France. They all don't want France to become too powerful, because it's around this time that the French really start expanding as a European power. Now, you also have, as I said, Spain, who get into a few alliances and treaties with the English, although they're not always the best of friends. They are allies on paper, and they do try and help each other out. The English and the Britons, they try and help each other out from time to time, like with the Breton crisis when the English invaded for them. And now we also have Burgundy, who are also called the Netherlands. Also didn't really get on with the French because the French were the big power and everyone didn't want them to get too powerful. Now, the English traded mostly with the Burgundians, and England's largest export was cloth because they could get a lot of wool, because especially in the north, because of the pastoral farming, they had a lot of sheep. So most of the English wool, or the English cloth rather, would go to these Dutch or Burgundian ports. However, in 1493, we see there is a trade embargo with Burgundy because of its support for Yorkists usurpers. Now, Margaret of Burgundy, who is called Margaret of Burgundy because she married into the Burgundian royal family, is a Yorkist. She is Richard III, who was the last Yorkist king. She is actually his sister, so she has a vested interest to see rebellions against England, and she actually supports several of these rebellions. For example, Perkin Warbeck is supported from Margaret of Burgundy, as well as John de la Pole and Edmund de la Pole are also supported by her, and because of this, Henry sacrifices the trade with Burgundy to stop it going into the hands of this Yorkist sympathiser. However, the Intercursus Magnus, which is called the Great Treaty, which is Latin for the Great Treaty, this ends the embargo in 1496. The reason being because I think it's that Margaret stopped supporting the Yorkist usurpers, so there was less tension, and because the embargo, it wasn't really favourable for the English. It didn't really do as much damage. The Dutch merchants and the English were just being disadvantaged by it, so they signed this treaty to stop the embargo happening so that trade could continue between the two, and it did after that. Now, there is another treaty that we have to look into called the Intercursus Malus, which is the Evil Treaty. And this was actually a forced treaty because Philip of Burgundy went to collect his wife's dowry when Isabella of, I think it's Castile, that she died in Spain, so he went to Spain by boat, but the boat was shipwrecked in England, and then Henry forced him to sign this treaty because, well, what's he going to do? He can't really say no if he's been captured by the English. Now, this was a very unfavourable treaty to the Burgundians, basically imposed a lot of taxes on the Flemish or Burgundian merchants in England, and stopped any taxes being imposed on the English trading in Burgundy. And this treaty was actually never recognised by the French or by the Holy Roman Empire or by Spain, and it never really went into action anyway. So we also see that Henry, whenever he can, he absolutely milks to the bone the cash cow of fortune. And we see this in the 1497 Cornish uprising, which was an uprising over taxes where the miners had to pay taxes. There are a lot of tin mines in Cornwall and they didn't like paying these taxes. It went back to some old law, but that's really besides the point. And they go up in rebellion. You know, Perkin Warbeck gets in and then he shits himself and runs away when the English army turns up, and they are completely defeated, I believe, at the Battle of Blackheath. But don't quote me on the name, it's something Heath. And what he does actually is he rounds up the ringleaders of the rebellion, Henry VII, and he has them executed. And then he says to the rest of the army, right, okay, I'm going to fine you all. So he fines this huge Cornish army, and then they go home. So he gets lots of money and he's quelled the rebellion. So it's just, he's just making use of the good fortune. Now, another example of this is actually the Treaty of Étaples, which was a treaty with the French. Now, a bit of background, it was signed after the English invaded northern France in 1492 and when they captured the city of Boulogne during the Breton crisis. Again, this was to invade France because they were invading the Bretons, who had a treaty with the English, and they all didn't want the French to get too powerful. So I have the ego bar of Henry as well, because this was actually a really clever move on his part. Now, another thing that the Treaty of Étaples promised was that the French would withdraw all their support from Yorkist usurpers. Furthermore, we see that the French have to pay a staggering sum of 142,000 crowns to the English, and this was absolutely huge. And just to show how huge it was, this would have increased Henry's treasury by at least half in one go. So imagine you have Henry's treasury, and then you just get another half of that treasury just added on from this one treaty. So he really is a very clever diplomat. And all I have to say is, screw you, Christine Carpenter. Henry VII was successful in his foreign policy.